Morning, everybody. Having just done that little exercise that Roger proposed, I now feel like saying something completely different to what's written down on my bit of paper. My kind of involvement with the NHS started in a kind of funny way. So many years ago, there was a small boy in Africa who was listening to a Philips transistor radio, green and white, in the garden. And there was a story about the National Health Service in England. And that small boy knew he wanted to be a doctor and went in and spoke to his mum about the National Health Service. And his mum explained the values, essentially, that unlike the country that he lived in, where there were enormous inequalities and disparities of kind of social justice, that irrespective of who you were, how much money you had, what your beliefs were, the color of your skin, when you needed healthcare, you could get it, and you could get it to a very high quality, and you could get it without having to worry about money. And that small boy thought about that and said, I'd like to work there one day. That small boy was me. And so the thing that really attracts me to the health service is the values which bind everybody that works in it together. And those values get tested from time to time. And one of the things that I think in the sort of role that people like I have, which can sometimes be a bit remote, is that we forget that healthcare is a people business. It's about, essentially, in a metaphor, two people sitting in a room, one person who needs help and the other person who is offering it to them. And the person who needs help often is fearful, anxious, in pain, scared. And we need to remember that we're there to help that person, and that everything we do, whether it is the real estate in which we function, whether it's the IT processes, the HR processes, the regional processes, the government processes, they only really work if they help that encounter to work effectively. And we quite often get that mix wrong. And that's my kind of starting position, because I think it's groups like this that can help to try and get at least some of those components right. And so at one level, I want to paint to you a kind of upbeat picture about the NHS and its future. And at another level, I want you to understand that we understand how difficult it is for people who are delivering the services on the coalface, if you like, at the moment. So I'd like you just to sit back and think of some of the achievements of this country in terms of global healthcare. I'd like you just to imagine for a moment that you lived in a country which had made a major contribution to medical science, that had discovered that the mosquito was the carrier of malaria, that had developed the theory of evolution, that had discovered the double helix, that had developed all the chemistry for unraveling that double helix, that had developed the first antibiotic, that had done the first blood transplant, that had done the first stem cell transplant, that had developed the ability to stop and start the heart electively, the basis of modern heart surgery, which is my specialty, that had cloned the first mammal in the terms of Dolly the sheep, that in a district general hospital had developed in vitro fertilization, which has changed the lives of so many families around the world. And then if you imagine that that country also had made a contribution to the kind of medical device industry by inventing simple things like the clinical thermometer, the intraocular lens, the electrocardiogram, the laryngeal mask for anesthesia, and the more complicated things such as the MRI scanner and the CT scanner. That's a remarkable heritage for that country. And then if you imagine that country also had 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, and per capita of population for Nobel Prizes in medicine or physiology, twice as many as the United States. That country also developed 14 of the top 75 drugs in the world, and had a thriving medical device industry. you would think that's a pretty good place to be, that's a pretty good starting position. But then, if you thought that that country also had the biggest semi-integrated healthcare system in the world, which saw something of the order of 400 million people a year in its pharmacies, 360 million a year in its primary care, 100 million in community services, 100 million outpatients a year, admitted 16 million people to its hospitals a year, transacted over 1 billion prescriptions a year, had 12 million telephone calls a year to its prime service, maybe 24 million when you add them all up. When you start to add those figures up, the number of encounters that we have with patients every day is over 1 million. So imagine if you could link all that scientific and academic endeavor with a health service that had so many encounters with people. I put it to you that there is the potential to have the best healthcare system in the world. Now, I'd say it's only a stone's throw away, and there'll be a bunch of people who argue about the weight of the stone and how far you have to throw it. But the point is, where there is a will, there is a way. And when you look back to 1947, I don't want anybody to think that I actually remember that. But if you go back to that time, things were far worse than they were now. There have been the worst floods for 53 years. There had been a winter of exceptional severity. There was an exchange rate problem with the dollar. You're starting to see some similarities. Rationing in a number of things, from bacon to meat to bread to potatoes, was worse than it had ever been during the war. So times were really hard. And that was the time that we established the National Health Service. So my hypothesis to you is that really good things can come out of bad things. Now, on a day-to-day basis, a problem that we're all grappling with, whatever part of the health service you work in, is that we're caught in this kind of quadruple pincer of increasing demand, in the case of our health service about 4% per year, escalating costs, particularly in the therapeutics, changing public and professional expectations, and frankly, just not enough money to do everything we want. And we think that's unique to the National Health Service. Well, believe me, it is just as big a problem in North America as it is in Zimbabwe. Nobody can afford everything they want to do. So we have a very practical problem. It's not a quadratic equation, but it's still a significant problem, in that we have to continue to treat the number of patients that need our help. We need to offer them the quality of care that we want to offer them and that they deserve. And the issues which I've just raised mean that that is really, really difficult. So the thing that links quality and productivity, not just in our health service, but in other industries around the world, is innovation. And when I look at the 20 or so companies that are in the FTSE 100 index that have survived since its inception, they've all been through some kind of turmoil. And it seems to me, and I'm no economist, is that they do three things. First of all, they take control of their money. And actually in the health service, broadly speaking, we've been pretty good at operating within the funds that have been voted for us by Parliament. They ask their customers what they want, and they innovate accordingly, because if they don't do those two things, they go out of business. But I just ask you to reflect for a while on how well you think the health service has done the latter two things. But the other thing that those companies do is they do all of those things urgently. So there is an incentive, a survival incentive, which means that you need to understand your problems and act quickly. Now, our health service employs, I hear various numbers, but somewhere of the order of 1.2 to 1.4 million people. And I think it's a really important point that people who work outside the health service can offer commentary. But it's only those people working in the service who can actually change it. And my hypothesis to you, which I'll come back to at various points, is that the intellectual capacity for solving the problems that I've just described lies in the minds and the creativity of the people who work in the service, not in the people who are passing the comments. They can seed the ideas, but it's only us that know how to solve them. And the next point in this thought process is that we need to be really clear. There is no hierarchy for good ideas. Just because you're Secretary of State or a chief executive of an organization or a medical director or a director of nursing in no way means your ideas are any better than anybody else's. In fact, the likelihood is it's the opposite. Because most of the good ideas that I've come across have come from young, apparent so-called junior people working in organizations who know what's going on the floor on a day-by-day basis. And they see where the problems are and they see where the good things are. And the real issue is, how do we encourage organizations to listen to them? Now, also, when there are some very significant things I think we need to be really proud of in our NHS. It's very easy to focus on the problems, but we can only address the problems if we know that we have in the past solved those problems. And so, I'm just going to mention a few things that I think we've done really well, which have been difficult to do. So round about, I probably got the year wrong, round about 2009, 10, we started to think, how do we improve our trauma services? And it became clear to us that we should follow some international best practice. We should establish trauma centers and a set of trauma networks. And what this meant was that somebody suffering severe trauma might be picked up by an ambulance. That ambulance could drive past one, in some cases two, standard A&E departments to get to the trauma center. And when we put these kind of out into the public domain, certain newspapers said, this is utterly scandalous. It's never going to work. People are going to die in the ambulances. What are these guys smoking? Was essentially the message. In the first year of operation, the odds ratio for survival for people with severe risk-adjusted injuries went up by 15%. In the second year of operation, the odds ratio went up by 30%. And in the third year of operation, the survival odds ratio went up by 50%. Job done. And the reason why this worked was because it was driven by the people that knew about trauma and how to develop those services. In other words, the people on the front line. It wasn't driven politically, it wasn't driven administratively, it was driven by people who had a desire to do the very best they could for their patients. The second area that I'd like to focus on is primary angioplasty for heart attacks. So I found myself recently at a kind of mecca for cardiovascular disease in the United States. And there, I may have these figures slightly wrong, but you'll get the drift. Their mean time from door to balloon for somebody having a serious heart attack was 52, I think, minutes. In this country, for people that have a serious heart attack, and for those of you that are interested in seeing an ST elevation myocardial infarction, over 98% of people get primary angioplasty. And they get it quickly. The median time in this country is 42 minutes. That's for the whole population. There are a few very remote areas of the country where people can't get this done quickly. And why have we done that so well? Because this was driven by the cardiological community wanting to improve services, but with the support from organizations and the Department of Health and others. So when you have people who know what needs to be done and know how to do it, and they get the support from people, I suppose, like me and others who work in this slightly different area, we can make stuff happen. The third area, I think, is stroke. So in London, until relatively recent, well, until about 2010, there were 32 hospitals admitting patients with stroke. And the cardiovascular people in London got together and said, this is crazy. You know, we now know that we can thrombolize people for stroke, and that if you can thrombolize them, you can get some really quite dramatic improvements in stroke. So once again, a big debate. The end result was that the number of units admitting strokes went from 32 to 8. again, an outcry in certain parts of the media about how patients would suffer as a consequence. The reality: reduced mortality, reduced length of stay, greater return to independent living, and tens of millions of pounds saved that can be reinvested in other aspects. And of course, the next issue we're going to have to address with strokes is mechanical thrombectomy, and we're working on that at the moment. And then one of the other areas, and Stephen pointed this out to me, that where we've made really, I think, absolutely fantastic progress.
This country is often rated as having the best information services, particularly in primary care, in the world. And that was down entirely to our GPs. You know, in the late 1990s, saying we need to do stuff, we need to have an electronic patient record. And the end result now is that we have fantastic electronic records in primary care. Sadly, secondary care lags a long way behind, and that is something we've got to address. What do all of these things have in common? They were all driven by people on the front line who wanted to make change.
So again, my hypothesis is that with the right cause and the right purpose and the right alignment, we can make really good things happen. And then as I look at what the drivers for change are going to be in healthcare systems around the world, I think there are 4 drivers for change. The first, numero uno, right out of the starting blocks before the others, is money. Because there is nowhere that can afford everything at once in healthcare. The second is going to be science and technology. And the third will be a set of public expectations. People want good value care. They want good quality care. And then the final is demographics. And then you might say, well, why is that guy putting demographics last when demographics are the big problem? Because basically, if you've got enough money, you can deal with the demographics. But we don't have enough money, so demographics are a big issue. In the science and technology world, I think it's going to be information technology that really changes things. And we're starting to see that. We're just on the crest of a wave, and it's only just beginning. But in the same way that information technology has brought immediacy of information to patients that was previously privileged knowledge and has changed the behavioral and social dimensions of healthcare practice, so we're going to see that it will turn healthcare increasingly into a knowledge transfer business. Healthcare at the moment is caricatured by the 2 people in a room that I described earlier, but that doesn't have to be a real room, it can be a virtual room. It can be a room defined by information technology as well as it can by bricks and mortar.
So whilst we offer a service now which is predominantly a delivery service with a small knowledge transfer limb, I think that'll become reversed. And you just need to think about what's happened to the travel industry. You used to have to go down to the travel agent between 9 and 5 on a Monday to Friday, look through some brochures and book something. Whereas now you do a lot of your transactions online using IT capability, but the travel agent still exists. And I think we're going to see similar parallel sorts of changes in healthcare. But one of some of the changes that I've mentioned to you have been quite big. But what I would say to you is, depending on the nature of where you work in the health service or what your ideas are, don't think that any idea is too small. Because when you start to add up the small ideas, it's a bit like if you look after the pennies, they look after the pounds. If you add up the small ideas, in aggregate, you can get a lot of change over a year, and a lot of innovation goes on every year in the health service. Small changes to the way services are delivered. People don't notice that, but we see it year on year on year. And people tend to just talk about the massive kind of disruptive changes that happen. But both, in my view, are equally important. But the one that is really sustainable is that we know if we look after the small ideas, they'll add up.
Then I find myself thinking, if you were Nye Bevan and you came back now, what would you do? Now, that in itself is probably a day's discussion. But one of the things that's going through my mind, and it's going through my mind because I'm talking about STPs later in the day, is at the time that the health service was set up, most people were dead within 2 years of retirement. So it's quite legitimate to build up a health service that would look after people who weren't well. But if you were setting off now and you had a clean sheet of paper, you would think of what's our big demographic problem? It's largely the elderly with a set of long-term conditions. And the elderly sit on a spectrum from those who require quite intensive medical care, and I use medical in the broad sense, healthcare, right through to those who might just need Meals on Wheels or something similar. One is organized by the health service, the other is organized by local authorities and social services. But the patients are on a spectrum, and yet we've created a health service and a set of social services with a massive bureaucratic, administrative, financial, and philosophical fracture between the two. Actually, it's not fit for purpose at the moment. And the idea of the STPs, which stands for Sustainability and Transformation Plans, I think of them slightly different. I think the P initially stands for pub talk. It's getting people in the same room to think about what they can do better, so people from local authority and social services together. Then the P will evolve into proposals, and then the P will evolve into plans. And at some point, we will get to a place where there are much closer relationships between local authorities and the health service. In time, I think that this will transmogrify into 44 accountable care organizations with their own finances and their own control totals, looking after their own populations, but it remains to be seen. That's kind of speculative over the course of the next couple of parliaments. Now, it seems to me that in Cumbria, you have some very specific issues. Some of the problems which need to be solved that I've alluded to are kind of relatively easy to solve in big metropolitan areas where you've got loads of people, loads of professionals, and loads of organizations who, if they work together, probably could do things well. It's not quite so easy in kind of bigger, less populated, remote, for want of a word, and rural areas. And so my hypothesis to you is that if we can get stuff right in Cumbria, our NHS is safe. And I think that's a really important message. And what I sense from speaking to Stephen and other colleagues is a real will to do that. And we will do from NHS England. Now, these are words that are kind of dangerous to say. We will do what we can to help. I know those words aren't always welcome, but we will. And the other thing that I found a bit funny, and I'll just finish on this, when I looked at the program today, I saw pottery and various other bits and pieces. And I thought this was about social prescribing. And having spoken to Stephen, I realized it wasn't. It was about giving people time to do something else while things went on in the back of their mind to promote their creativity. And it's easy to think that's all a bit odd. But if any of you ever get the chance to go to Google or to Apple, Google in particular, you walk in, it's not pottery, it's balloons, multicolored balls, slides, different colored chairs, people doing kind of their own thing. And they take that part of their business really, really seriously because it frees up people's minds, and there is an evidence base which suggests that if you do that, then you can engage with the creative part of your mind and ideas start to flow. And my sense is that that's kind of the aim of today, Stephen. And if some good ideas emerge from this, then I think the day will have been a success, but it'll only be a success if the ideas are transcribed into action. Thanks very much, and I hope that's